Joseph Stalin's foreign policy in brief. The 1930s were a decade of great tension in Europe and the Far East. Authoritarian states had emerged across Eastern Europe as well as in Germany, Italy and Japan, although these three countries also had ambitions to expand into neighboring and more distant countries to acquire empires. Stalin was not unaware of the threat posed by Germany and Japan to the security of the Soviet Union. In particular, Stalin feared the two-front war waged against Germany and Japan, and this became a real threat after these two countries signed the Anti-Comintern Pact in 1936. Maxim Litvinov was appointed the Commissar for External Affairs in 1930, and until he was replaced in 1939, he was the architect of Soviet foreign policy. At the first glance, Litvinov had many of the characteristics of Stalin's victims. He was an old Bolshevik who had joined the party in 1903. He was well-traveled and spoke many languages. He was married to an English woman, and he was Jewish. Yet, Litvinov survived possibly because his skills were needed in determining foreign policy, not an area of expertise for Stalin. It was Litvinov who proposed collective security for the USSR, resulting in his joining the League of Nations in 1934. He also favored closer cooperation with anti-fascist governments, a policy approved by the Comintern in 1935, after which Popular Front governments were established in France and Spain, and the Second United Front was set up in China. The weakness demonstrated by the League of Nations over the Manchurian crisis of 1931 and the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in 1935 damaged the reputation of collective security. Perhaps a closer relationship with Britain and France was never very realistic, as Britain in particular did not relish an alliance with the USSR. The likelihood of such an alliance was also undermined by the events of 1938, when Stalin was not invited to attend the Munich conference, although the USSR had an alliance with Czechoslovakia. According to Neil Ferguson, Litvinov explicitly told the British delegation to the League of Nations that if the Germans invaded Czechoslovakia, the Czechoslovak-Soviet Pact would come into force, and proposed a conference between Britain, France and the Soviet Union to show the Germans we mean business. By 1939, a close alliance with the French and the British looked increasingly unlikely, although in April, a poll held in Britain showed that 87% of respondents said they favored an alliance with France and the Soviet Union. The government of Britain did eventually send a delegation to Moscow in July, but they traveled by sea, suggesting there was no sense of urgency. Turning away from the West, Stalin aimed to foster closer cooperation with Nazi Germany. Litvinov, who would have been an unlikely emissary to Berlin, was replaced as Commissar of External Affairs by Vyacheslav Molotov. The famous Nazi-Soviet Pact was signed in August 1939. In a decade that came to be synonymous with messianic ideologies used to justify unspeakable acts of terror, it was truly shocking to see two avowed enemies sign a pact of neutrality that agreed to carve up Poland between them. Stalin was also concerned about security to the north and demanded that Finland relinquish territory to the USSR. When Finland refused, the Winter War broke out in November 1939. And although some Finnish territory was lost, more than 200,000 Red Army soldiers were killed. The weakness of the post-purge Red Army had been revealed, and this was noted by Hitler. Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's policy of Lebensraum led to the invasion of the Soviet Union and the planned colonization of its territory by the German Aryan race. According to the Neil Ferguson, the timing of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941 may have been influenced by Hitler's concern about Stalin's encroachment on Romania and the Balkans. In the summer of 1940, Stalin demanded that Romania hand over northern Bukova and Bessarabia, Moldova today, and this demand was followed by a promise of security for Bulgaria. Hitler started to plan the invasion at this point, beginning with a meeting of his military chiefs in June 1940. Stalin was alerted many times to German invasion plans by Richard Sorge, a double agent working in the German embassy in Tokyo, by the British who had cracked the German military NIGMA code, and by German informants who swam across the river Bug, but were shot as enemy agents. Ferguson estimates that there were 84 warnings in all sent to Moscow and that Stalin ignored them all. It seems Stalin trusted no one except Hitler and was afraid that any defensive action by the Red Army would be interpreted by the Germans as preparation for an attack. The Siege of Leningrad, from 41 to 44. Among the most famous events of the World War II on the Eastern Front were the long drawn-out efforts of the Nazi invaders to force the surrender of Leningrad and Stalingrad. Leningrad was the cradle of Bolshevik revolution as well as being the Venice of the North, a reference to its architectural and cultural prominence. It was considered imperative that the city be saved, and from 1941 to 1944 its population suffered bombardments and starvation to win through a 900-day siege. It is estimated that more than 600,000 people died out of a population of approximately 2,500,000. The Battle of Moscow, October 41 to January 42. Also known as the Operation Typhoon, the occupation of Moscow was considered by Hitler to be vital to the success of Operation Barbarossa. The defense of Moscow was led by General Zhukov, and aided by extremely harsh winter conditions, he was able to prevent German victory. The Battle of Kursk, 4th July, 23 August 1943. One of the largest land battles of the 20th century, the Battle of Kursk was fought between the Red Army, fielding 3,600 tanks and 1,300,000 soldiers, and the German Army, fielding 2,700 tanks and 800,000 soldiers. Although the Red Army lost 1,500 tanks and suffered 806,000 casualties, this engagement was their victory, and the Battle of Kursk led the way to the recovery of the city of Kharkov. The Siege of Stalingrad, from 1942 to 43. Stalingrad could not be sacrificed because its original name, Tsaritsyn, had been changed to Stalingrad in honor of Stalin. Today it is Volgograd. Sitting astride the river Volga, the city, if it could be captured, offered the Germans the possibility of diverting Soviet oil supplies from the Caucasus to the Red Army force further north. The German army, Group B, nearly succeeded in capturing the city, but the Soviet counteroffensive encircled, trapped, and destroyed the German 6th Army and much of the 4th Army. The German defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943 was seen as the turning point of the war, the beginning of Germany's retreat back to the Reich. Hitler had refused permission for General Friedrich von Paulus, the commander of German forces at Stalingrad, to break out from the encirclement in a timely manner, and thus consigned hundreds of thousands of men to either death or capture. So finally, the tide turned against Germany in 1943, and over the next 2 years, the Red Army marched westwards in the wake of the retreating Germans. The Red Army claimed to have liberated the Baltic states, Poland, and much of Central and Eastern Europe. Post-1989 interpretations in these countries, however, would argue that although the German army was driven out, what followed was another occupation. Meanwhile, an estimated 2 million German women were raped in the areas occupied by the Red Army. The wartime conferences at Tehran, Moscow, and Yalta all dealt with the borders of post-war Europe, and Stalin was adamant that the next war must not be fought on Soviet soil. The German surrender to the Soviet Union took place on 8th of May 1945. It was not until the 9th August that the Soviet Union joined the war on Japan, occupying northern Manchuria and acquiring the Kuril Islands and South Sakhalin. Stalin ruled the Soviet Union from 1929 until 1953, longer than any other leader. He created the Soviet system of government and was the undisputed leader of world communism during his lifetime. Stalin had not been in good health for several years before his death, and in March 1953 he suffered a stroke that killed him. When he died, there was much relief, but also anguish about the future of the Soviet Union. Stalin had gathered around him a small group of dedicated supporters who knew that not only their jobs but their lives depended on Stalin's goodwill. He never ceased to tell those most likely to succeed him that when he was gone, the West would challenge the Soviet Union and the capitalists will crush you like little kittens. In fact, the USSR maintained its role as a world superpower, but the legacy of Stalin continued through the all-powerful secret police, the lack of political freedom, and the strictly controlled command economy.